So please welcome Peter. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you again, and certainly through this morning's sessions, I heard lots of energy from the room. So I hope lunch has sustained you and will enable you to keep your energy levels high for the remainder of the day. And I do certainly look forward to having some dialogue and some conversation. But I'd like to share some observations with you about this question of marketable skills, certainly building on some of the conversations that we've had already. In particular, I'd like to offer, in a sense, an outsider's perspective on these questions. So not the perspective of a practitioner, like many of you here in the room, but the perspective of someone who works with many colleges and universities across the country and is seeing many different sorts of approaches to addressing these challenges. So just very briefly to give you a little bit of background on that perspective, Huron is a large diversified management consulting firm. We focus on things like education, life sciences, healthcare, some general business activities as well. We were founded in 2002 and public in 2004. Today we're about 3,000 employees. Our higher education practice is about 650 consultants, and we work with about 300 to 350 institutions annually in a wide variety of capacities, including things like strategy, operations, research, and technology. I sit within our strategy and operations group. So I focus on university strategic planning, operational improvement, and also student success. My particular interest in this issue of marketable skills or employability really emerged a few years prior to my joining Huron while I was at Northeastern University. And as Ellen had mentioned, I was a vice president there working in the president's office. And one of my charges while I was at Northeastern was to help the university develop an account management model for collaborating with its 3,000 corporate partners. So Northeastern, as some of you may know, is a co-op institution. And so what that means is if you are an undergraduate student at Northeastern, it's going to take you 5 years to complete your bachelor's degree. And that's because you're going to head out into the workforce 3 times over the course of that 5 years and spend 6 months in the job market each of those 3 times, so 18 months in total, with real work experience. You're going to be paid for that work experience, and then you're going to come back to the university and incorporate what you've learned in the professional market into your further studies. So we've got about 8,000 students doing co-op annually and about 3,000 corporate partners collaborating with us to provide those jobs to students. So how does the university manage those relationships? And I think this is one of the big issues for all of us to wrestle with. How do we create value for our employer partners? How do we establish and manage those relationships? And how do we ensure that they are having let's say, a coordinated experience with the university that they're partnering with, and not hearing one day from someone in the business school and another day, from someone in health sciences and another day from someone in computer science? How do we treat those relationships in a thoughtful and effective way so that we're able to really create win-win-win value for the employers, for the students, and for the institution as well? So it's not a simple question, and there's still lots of work to be done. A university like Northeastern is fortunate in that it has been engaged in this activity for over 100 years. Co-op is not a new idea. Northeastern began doing it in 1905. University of Cincinnati was really the first institution in the U.S., also in 1905, to develop this co-op model. And today there are a variety of institutions that do this: Drexel University, Georgia Tech in Canada, Waterloo University. So it's a very old model, but in some respects is one that is perhaps well suited to this particular time that we find ourselves in. Co-op isn't the only way of accomplishing these goals. Internships, apprenticeships, and other sorts of things are relevant as well. But this notion of how do we engage with the marketplace? How do we help our students engage? How do we help our institutions engage? And what are all of the variety of ways that we engage with them? So those are some of the issues that I want to cover today. This book project emerged out of some of those conversations, and in particular, what I focused on there was really the role of large, complex research universities in fostering good employment outcomes for their students. And one of the reasons why I focused on research universities is that there's already quite a sufficient literature on the role of community colleges. This is, very much in the DNA of community colleges or junior colleges, and they already are very mature and established processes for working with the local employment market. But very, very little written really about the role of research universities in this effort. And so in particular, I focused on a few cases at places like New York University and Georgia Tech and a few others, but also looked at a variety of other sorts of institutions, really trying to identify a kind of a menu of options for us to consider as we seek to effectively connect our students with the employment market, both while they're students and then afterwards as they're graduates. So I think two issues that I want to come back to is how the institution, the college or the university, is situated within an ecosystem that's pretty complex. There are lots of stakeholders in this ecosystem, and it's pretty uncoordinated. We kind of let everybody do their own thing, and it's difficult to marshal all of these forces in a way that creates a multiplier effect. But increasingly, that's what's being asked of us. And I think, Texas has been a fantastic leader and a model for other states across the country in attempting to do this effectively. And in fact, this event, I think, is one sure signal of that. I also do have in my background not only some university administrator experience, but if I go back far enough in time, I was also once upon a time an academic myself. I taught at Stony Brook University in New York. I taught at Tufts University in Massachusetts and a few other places. And so I also have that perspective of someone in the classroom. But again, not really a practitioner perspective today, really that of sort of an intermediate third party who has the privilege of seeing what lots of different institutions are doing across the country. So first, let's just define the objective and talk a little bit about what we mean by marketable skills. As we've already discussed today, there are lots of frameworks out there. I saw in the career services session earlier this morning, a description of all different sorts of skills that, various university-led initiatives have developed to try to define this stuff. And at a high level, it's not that challenging, but at a detailed level, it's certainly not that easy. So let me just situate that by starting with our 60 by 30 initiative. And so we see that in that strategic plan, it's defined this way. Those skills valued by employers that can be applied to a variety of work settings, including interpersonal, cognitive, and applied skills areas. These skills can either be primary or complementary to the major and are acquired by students through education, including curricular, co-curricular, and extracurricular activities. So that's actually a very nicely concise definition. I think it hits many of the right notes. And it sounds like, okay, I think that's a working definition. I think we know what we're talking about. The problem is, once you start talking to employers, lots of other things start to float into the conversation as well. And so when we ask employers what are the things they're looking for, we end up with a more heterogeneous list of cognitive and non-cognitive skills. We heard this morning some dialogue about hard versus soft. I know that some folks are out there trying to rebrand soft skills as power skills. I don't know if that's going to catch on, but it's a good try. It's a good try. But we do see things like, and we heard some fantastic examples of some of these qualities last night during the student panel. I don't know how many of you had a chance to see that, but it was really fantastic to hear the stories of the students here in Texas who have demonstrated, grit, passion, determination, resilience, and have taken really effective use of the individual mentors available to them, the faculty, the professional networks, and really had great success. So we see some of these kinds of qualities being signaled, but also increasingly things like mindfulness, empathy. There's an interesting company working in the marketplace right now. It's about 4 years old. It's called Koru. And it was founded by someone who used to be the deputy head of higher education at the Gates Foundation, a gentleman named Josh Jarrett. And Koru has a set of tools now that help companies select job candidates, right? Because just like in higher education, where we're all getting more and more applications thanks to technology, in the job market, we see the same thing. And so it's becoming increasingly difficult in an electronic or paper-based model to understand where is the quality, where is the talent. And so an organization like Koru has an assessment, and it sells this assessment to employers to help them screen applicants. And they have something called the Koru 7 Impact Skills, and those include grit, ownership, curiosity, polish, teamwork, rigor, and impact. Again, okay, well, that seems pretty sensible. But if we drill down a little bit, what do we really mean by impact? What do we really mean in this case by rigor? What do we really mean by ownership? These are difficult things to assess, difficult things to measure, and certainly difficult things to create apples-to-apples comparisons when we look at candidate A versus candidate B. Nevertheless, this is the environment we find ourselves in, where we are striving hard, as we heard from our first session this morning, trying to meet stated objectives without really knowing what the objectives mean. It's hard to get someplace when you don't know quite where you're going. We have this probability cloud. We sort of know where we want to land, but there's some little bit of ambivalence about quite where we do need to land. So why are these conversations so important? There are a variety of reasons. And again, the reasons vary by stakeholder. On one level, it has to do with jobs, right? Today, as of March of this year, we have 6.3 million open jobs. And we also have 6.7 million unemployed, work-ready Americans. There seems to be a matching problem. Why aren't we able to bring this talent in the labor pool together with these jobs? Now, there's this thing called the skills gap, and there's been a lot of scholarly analysis of the claim that there is such a thing, and you can get pretty scholarly about it if you like, and take positions that it does or doesn't exist. But the fact is, there's a sense that the rapidity with which business is evolving, technology is evolving, that it's not hard for someone in the labor force to quickly fall behind. And so one of the other things we have to think about, in addition to where do universities fit within this complex ecosystem, is how do we think about the role of the institution in delivering education for the lifetime, right? Not just a 2-year associate degree, not just a 4-year bachelor's, but some combination of degree and non-degree experiences over the lifetime that teach individuals how to adapt and how to draw on the skills and talents they have to meet the current labor market conditions. So that's certainly one of the imperatives here, is to address the needs of the labor market. As we've also heard, though, parents, and I'm one of them, I have a son who's a sophomore in college and a daughter who's a junior in high school. Parents want their children to have good lives, and part of that means having interesting and positive and productive careers. And so when you go around and your child is doing the college search and you visit campus after campus and there's a student leading you by walking backwards, telling you about, the Quidditch team and all of the clubs and all of that stuff, the parents invariably do not ask, well, can my child get on the Quidditch team? They tend to focus on, will my child get a job? And what are your placement rates? And what sorts of internships do you offer? So this is something that parents, certainly, and students care very much about. And as we've heard, and David made this point, first thing this morning, this is not an either-or proposition. It's not education or employment outcomes. It needs to be some kind of both and certainly we need to understand that this is very relevant and important to those two constituencies. Additionally, we know here in the state of Texas, we know here in the United States, at the state and the federal level, educational outcomes matter. We know that economic performance correlates with educational outcomes, so that we know that one of the ways to strengthen the educational productivity of a region or a state, et cetera, is to improve the educational outcomes of that state or region, and hence the 60 by 30 goal here in Texas. So there's a return on investment that state governments and federal government are seeking, and that's a consequence of the investments that they are making. So they want to see those resources put to good use. And of course, institutions also have a vested interest in good outcomes. Increasingly, the value proposition for higher education is around these kinds of outcomes. And so if you want to attract high potential students, you need to be able to demonstrate that you can produce these kinds of outcomes. So it now becomes not only part of your mission, but it becomes also an important feature of your ability to compete in the marketplace for what nationally is soon to be a shrinking body of prospective students. Demographically, nationally, we're going to grow. We've been through a trough for the past few years. We're starting to grow out of it. We'll continue to grow until about 2025. We'll have about a 7% increase in the total number of post-secondary students in the U.S. over the next 7 years or so. And then we're going to see a 15% decline over the next 5 years. And that's because of the recession in 2008. People weren't having kids. And so we now have this birth dearth, and we're going to face increased competition for getting students into the classroom. Now, places like Texas and the Southwest are actually seeing net positive growth, and will probably continue to see relatively strong growth. But where I'm situated in the Northeast, it's bad news today, and it's going to get a lot worse. In fact, the Northeast is projected to see a 20% decline over 2025 to 2030. So that means you're going to start seeing schools from up where I live coming down to try to recruit students in your high schools, and that's going to create challenges, for everyone. At the same time, there are also venture capitalists and entrepreneurs who want to create companies that can start to address some of the gaps in the marketplace that they perceive. And I'm a big fan of career services, and I think it's absolutely one of the unsung heroes in higher education. But there are a lot of investors out there betting that they can put you out of business, that they can do it better, that they can do it with an app, and it'll be a lot cheaper for universities, and you won't have 67 people in your career services office, as I know you all do. And last but not least, there are think tanks and foundations like the Lumina Foundation, the Gates Foundation, and numerous others that have a stake in these outcomes as well. So it's a noisy dialogue with lots of stakeholders. Now, there are good reasons for engaging in this kind of work, and there are different sorts of benefits that accrue to all of these different participants. But the challenge, as I say, is getting alignment among these different stakeholders, right? So if we think about for students, they get jobs out of it at the end of the day, but perhaps even more importantly, they learn how to be adaptable. They learn how to learn. They learn how to cope with the fact that economies change, companies come and go, industries rise and fall, and so they have to learn how to be adaptable. And as the phrase marketable skills implies, they learn how to talk about their skills in a way that enables them to succeed in the job market. For institutions, it's an opportunity to deliver on the mission, right? To meet the objectives of their own day-to-day activities. And also, as I say, to enhance their value proposition, to compete more effectively, particularly as we move into a phase where there's going to be some scarcity when it comes to prospective students. And it's also, as I pointed to a moment ago, an opportunity to deliver lifelong learning. Now, this is a concept that's been with us for decades. Again, it's not new, but it's more and more relevant. We cannot assume that a one-and-done approach to education is sufficient to power someone for a lifetime. And I did my undergraduate degree and my doctorate at the same institution. And back in the olden times when I did that, that was considered bad form. If you did 2 degrees at one institution, you had a limited view of the world, you lacked imagination, and you weren't testing yourself. Nowadays, there isn't an institution I work with that isn't thinking about retaining its alumni as future customers, right? So everybody now is thinking about lifetime ownership of their alumni, as they rightly should, because if you are delivering value to your students, once they graduate and get out into the market, provided you have continuing professional education, provided you have graduate programs, you should want to continue to serve them as they progress in their careers. And of course, employers are seeking a stronger talent pipeline. They're expecting more of their new entry-level employees, and they expect them to come in ready to do all kinds of things that in the past they might not have been expected to do until they'd been trained for 26 weeks or something like that. Today, they're expected to come ready. And increasingly, employers want to inform curricula. They don't just want to wait and see what you're going to produce. They want to come in and have a conversation with you and help you think about the shape of that curricula. And of course, that also opens up opportunity for other kinds of dialogue around research collaboration or corporate philanthropy and so forth. And for alumni, which is an increasingly important player in this whole conversation, alumni can serve as mentors to your current students. Alumni want to give, and they want to give more than just money. They want to give their experience, their time, their interest, their motivation. And again, in the student panel last night, we heard some great stories about the role of mentoring in helping them to progress. But alumni also, as they advance in their own careers, start to become recruiters themselves. They start to be able to write those philanthropy checks. So there are lots of reasons for thinking about maintaining those relationships in a truly engaged way. And of course, also, they are prospective students of yours as they seek their own further education. And of course, they have family members and children and nieces and et cetera. So there are all sorts of opportunities. And then, as I say, for state governments, it's about efficient use of tax dollars, and it's about economic development. And that means being able to attract employers to spur, further economic development. It becomes a virtuous circle. And I had some conversation at dinner last night with some of our other attendees about the challenges of being a great university in a dying city. There are lots of them out there. A university alone cannot create an employment market. It can serve an employment market, but it can't create one by itself. So we need to think about how we can attract industry to the regions where we have great universities. So all of these great opportunities, all of these potential benefits, but there are lots of obstacles to effectively realizing all of these opportunities. And so, as I say, there's insufficient coordination among all of these different actors in the environment. And in fact, there's often competition and conflict between the different actors. And then, as we heard earlier this morning, there's also some rather unproductive debates about whether or not education is worth the price it is. Almost no matter what the price is, it's worth it, as the data shows. But you might not be getting quite as good a return as you did, back in the day. When I went to undergraduate college, my tuition was about $600 a semester. Right? That's a lot better than paying $35,000 a year, at an elite private university, or $70,000 a year. We also see the rise of alternative providers. And again, this creates consternation and complexity in the marketplace and investments going in ways that might not always be the most productive. And as I say, this question of, are we sufficiently prepared for the demographic shifts that are coming our way? And of course, the short answer is no, we're not. But they are coming. And there's also, and this is very important, this is one of the great roles that career services functions serve, is to raise awareness for students about all the resources that are already out there for them. I mean, one of the things that's just a fact of life is that students probably can't name more than 5 companies. So when they start thinking about jobs, they don't even know what the job opportunities are, what the companies are that are out there, what the various industries are. Thankfully, we have a growing list of initiatives trying to create these awareness of pathways for students. And here in Texas, we have Seek UT, which was just announced a few months ago. We've also got things like Skillful.com, which is a collaboration of LinkedIn, the Markle Foundation, Arizona State University. So a variety of different initiatives, and we also heard this morning about ONET Online, trying to create greater transparency for students. And then the Georgetown University Center for Education and the Workforce is an absolutely fantastic organization. Tony Carnevale is the executive director there, doing some incredible research on the relationship between particular disciplines of study and career paths and career outcomes and so forth. So there's a lot more information out there today, certainly, than there was 10, 20, or 30 years ago, and part of our job is to get that in the hands of our students. So how do we promote these marketable skills now that we have some sense of what it is and who cares about it? Well, one of the important things is not to fall into these counterproductive debates about either or, right? And so if we were having this conversation 5 years ago, these headlines would have been all about how useless the liberal arts are. The good news is today, 10 years on from the recession, people have gotten over that. There is a recognition, okay, it's both and. We need the liberal arts plus some narrow and deep skills. We need a broad education, but we also need some focus. And this is something that universities are not good at. Once we create these swim lanes where faculty are in a certain discipline, and that's what they do, it's hard to collaborate across functions and units and lines. And yet this is what the employment market is challenging us to do. So this is something that we have to get better at. But as you can see, the story in the public narrative has sort of swung back to actually the liberal arts are producing good outcomes, but we need to think about how we tell that story to the marketplace so that there's less confusion. Now, certainly we will see, pointing back to the Georgetown University Center that I mentioned a moment ago, this is some of their data, on the earnings by various degrees and disciplines. And you'll see that there's not some insignificant variation there. If you look at STEM, if you look at the average for all majors, which is the yellow line, or if you look at some of the areas like the humanities, you're going to see different financial outcomes. That's true. But financial outcomes are not the only outcomes. And this was another interesting theme from last night's conversation with the students. Again and again, they pointed to instances where they took a new job opportunity that was going to challenge them to learn more and to, in a sense, invest in their own future for a greater growth later, rather than take the high paid position they were being offered right now. And so we need to be thinking about earning not just 9 months out or 6 months out or 3 years out or 5 or 10 years, but really over the lifetime. And again, earnings are only one kind of outcome, and we should be considering the others as well, and teaching our students to think about those. So we need to blend the liberal arts and the professional programs or the more scientific disciplines. And we hear a variety of voices within higher education telling us this. These messages are not just coming at us, as they were for a number of years from think tanks and government folks, and legislators and so on. These messages now are really coming from within higher education. And so I have a quote here from Matt Siegelman, who is the president of Burning Glass. Are there any institutions here that use Burning Glass data? Any? 1, 2? Okay. Burning Glass collects data on job postings. They have a database of millions of jobs. And what they help universities do is think about how those job postings map to their curriculum portfolio. And so one of the ways in which you can use their data is to figure out, are you describing your programs and the outcomes they produce in the same way that employers are advertising jobs? Are you using the same keywords? So are you enabling your graduates to go off into the job market using the same language that employers are using so that they can more effectively market their skills? You can also use this data to help inform your thinking about, well, where's the growth economically in our region, and what programs and disciplines should we be investing in order to meet the labor market needs in our particular area? So one of the arguments that Burning Glass will make with its research is, in fact, liberal arts skills are highly valued, but increasingly more highly valued when they're coupled with some technical skill. So it might be an elective course, it might be an add-on certificate, it could be a graduate degree, but something that combines that broad liberal education with, let's say, expertise in data analytics or sales or marketing or whatever it may be. And then we also have a comment here from Richard Aram and Josipa Roxa, who wrote Academically Adrift, which was sort of a game-changing book about 8 years ago or so, which explained why, although we're educating students every year, very few of them seem to be learning very much while they're in college, and they weren't showing a lot of progression over the course of their education. And their argument is that in addition to more rigorous curriculum, we also need to create these co-curricular experiences that challenge students to apply what they're learning. And then also a comment here from the president of Drexel University, emphasizing the importance of those kind of co-curricular experiences, what he calls authentic connections to the workplace. And again, internships, co-ops, apprenticeships, among other sorts of initiatives, can provide that kind of benefit. And then a comment from Wendy Purcell, who's the president of Plymouth University in the UK, who argues that what we need today is both the traditional kinds of graduate skill set that we've always sought to produce, but also something plus, a graduate plus kind of experience where you also are able to demonstrate those job-ready skills and that ability to talk about your skills in that job marketplace. So what we have to do then is, in the course of our students' education, to build a bridge between the classroom and the workplace. And there are two ways that we can think about doing that. We can bring the student experience into the world of work, and that's what internships and co-ops make possible. Also, problem-based learning. There's some interesting companies out there that aggregate corporate projects so that faculty can go online and say, I'd like to pull down that project and have my students work on it in this course. And as one of the students was describing last night, producing an analysis for an external customer was one of the most powerful learning experiences she had. It's one thing to provide that quality work for your instructor, but it's another thing to know that there's someone outside who's going to read it, look at it, and may even take action on the basis of it. And so this kind of problem-based learning can be very powerful. At the same time, we want to bring the world of work into the classroom. And this is where your alumni can start to play an important part, bringing them in for visiting lectures, bringing them in as mentors, hosting boot camps. Not all instruction needs to be provided by the institution. And this is maybe a somewhat controversial notion, but the idea is that, professionals understand things as well. How can we tap into their expertise and help them augment what our students are learning in the classroom? And how can they serve as, advisory board members for curriculum committees? We're not suggesting, of course, that we should turn over the curriculum to the employment market. There are a lot of good reasons for not doing that. If you turn it over to them and they write the curriculum, in 3 months they'll come back and say, actually, we need to start over. Things have changed in our industry, so we need a new curriculum. We're not trying to train people for jobs. We're trying to train people for careers. We're trying to train people to be adaptable for a lifetime of learning. And then there are some activities that fall between these two concentric circles in the sort of Venn diagram, and things like the Capstone Design Expo at Georgia Tech. One of the important missed opportunities for lots of institutions is to not monetize their relationship with the employment market. You are, without question, serving as part of their HR team. You are providing service to them, and they are economically benefiting from that. And there are a growing list of institutions that are figuring out how to monetize that. And one of the ways that you can do that is through these kinds of challenges at Georgia Tech, where companies like CAT and AT&T and John Deere and numerous others provide funding to enable seniors to spend a year working on projects, and to do that in the form of a competition. And so to actually provide funds that students can invest in those projects as they prototype and develop solutions for whatever problem it is they're trying to address. But those kinds of experiences, in addition to what happens in the classroom, are what are really powerful for students. Now, as we've heard already today, it's not just about career services being the thing you do in the spring semester of your senior year. It's really about having a through line from the moment the students arrive on campus, if not earlier, right? Getting them to think about what their career choices are. And the story that you were telling, Alan, about this survey that invites students to pick, their areas of interest is something we should, consider adopting in our own institutions. But we want to create this through line so that from orientation to the first year experience to student advising, to career planning, that all of these things are thought of in a seamless way, things that will progress over the student's lifetime. And then I think very importantly, we need, and this is a difficult argument to make when there are lots of faculty in the room, but we need to elevate the co-curricular to the same level as the curricular. We know that a lot of learning happens outside the classroom. We need to value it in a similar way. Right? So, and we're starting to see this happen organically, but I think we need to become a little bit more self-conscious of it. And ultimately, we need to help our students build a portfolio of learning experiences, internship experiences, applied professional experiences, so that when they go out into the market, they do know how to market their own skills. Now, doing that requires working across functions, working across silos, and of course, we all know higher ed is great at that. Fantastic, but we could even be a little bit better, and that's something that we have to strive to do. Now, if we think about this ecosystem, right, lots of different players, one of the questions is, who's the dog and who's the tail and who's wagging whom? The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has been putting out a series of studies over the last 5 or 6 years called Managing the Talent Pipeline, and this is a graphic from one of their first reports. And it shows what they call a sort of talent development pipeline. And the top one is what they call the simple value chain, where you have a student who goes to an education provider who then gets a job. And their argument is that this is not the way the world actually works. It doesn't work that way today, if it ever worked that way, and it's certainly not going to work that way in the future. And what they then describe is this extended value chain, where you have a prospective student who goes off, may go to a traditional provider, but then goes to some other non-traditional provider, and then has another educational experience and another, and then may have some work-based training. So one of the things that we have to think about is, where do we fit in this value chain? What is the value that we uniquely add to that path? And how do we collaborate and fill in the gaps for students so that they're benefiting from what we are uniquely able to provide? Now, the argument of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is very much in the vein of, you guys aren't doing the job. We're not going to wait around for you to just produce the kind of graduates that we're seeking. And as a consequence, they are making an argument for what they call a demand-driven supply chain. They're going to tell us how to produce the kinds of employees that they need to recruit. Well, that's not necessarily the most productive approach. I think it would be more productive if we were learning how to collaborate. So colleges have to learn that they share the load. And they have to learn about where to collaborate, and how to think about, this notion of both competition and co-opetition in this environment. So here's just a scenario. Let's just say, a student gets an associate degree in accounting at Austin Community College, and then uses a company called Handshake, which many of you may work with. Anybody here use Handshake at their university? Okay. So a student goes to this database, finds a job through Handshake, right? That's one of those alternative venture-backed providers out there. And then, after some time in the workforce, decides to go get a bachelor's degree in business here at the University of Houston. And then decides, okay, I'm back in the labor force, but I still need some additional skills. There's this company called Udacity, which is creating these things called nano degrees. And maybe I want to go to Udacity and get a nano degree in digital marketing. And then maybe at my employer, I'm learning about data analytics in my on-the-job training. Well, that's the experience that your student is going to have over 10 to 15 years. So what's your role in getting that ball moving? And where do you come back into that path and provide top-up skills, graduate degrees, and other experiences that can add value? Now, the risk is, if you don't figure out the answer to that question, there's a not completely implausible scenario where you're disintermediated, where you're left out of the conversation. And that's really where the U.S. Chamber of Commerce argument is headed. Very unlikely, but nevertheless, that's a current in this public discourse. So here's a slightly different scenario where a student goes to LinkedIn to select a college. Not U.S. News, not your website, but it's going to go look at graduates, people who've gone to your school, gotten jobs, and been successful. Okay, so the student uses LinkedIn to find a mentor to assist in finding that first job after enrolling in that institution that LinkedIn recommended, and then decides to pursue a new degree at another institution ranked by LinkedIn. And then, now in the workplace, LinkedIn, as you may know, which is owned by Microsoft, bought a company called lynda.com for $1.5 billion. And lynda.com is a library of training courses. Lots of organizations use lynda.com. Huron, for some of our internal training, we use lynda.com courses. So it's an opportunity for LinkedIn to say, we know you're in job A. We know you're looking at jobs B, C, and D. You don't have the skills for those jobs. You could have the skills if you took these 4 lynda.com courses. They're in the middle of that whole exchange. They see what prospective students are doing, and they're able to deliver that education or training opportunity on a just-in-time basis. And then in addition, they may land in that next job, and the employer, again, may be offering courses via lynda.com. So that's just one scenario. It's not all about LinkedIn, but LinkedIn is operating at scale, and it represents one scenario where we get left out of the equation, and we aren't delivering the value that we're uniquely positioned to deliver. So what should our institutions do? We don't want to narrowcast. We don't want to think about vocational tracking. We don't want to think about limiting options. We want to allow students to try, fail, discover, come back, double back, move forward again. All of the disciplines offer valuable skills. What we want to do is to create greater transparency for students about the skills they will develop in particular disciplines and what quality of development they'll have as a result of those particular disciplines. And we need to think about the benefits of blending some of those disciplines in terms of their own career outcomes. We also need to help them understand that each career path comes with certain trade-offs. And you know, the history of education is filled with students who think they want to be pre-med and discover they don't, or they think they want to be lawyers and very quickly they realize they don't. And so we need to create these off-ramps and then on-ramps for them as they think about their next opportunity. And then we also need to be thinking about this notion of the language that we use to talk about the educational experiences that we're providing, and does that language resonate with the market, or are we giving students a vocabulary that's completely useless to them once they start going out and looking for jobs? And we also, I hope this doesn't sound like a completely controversial statement, but we also need to consider sunsetting or perhaps mothballing programs where there isn't demand, where there's no scale, where there isn't an employment need locally that we're meeting. Now, I'm not saying that that means like, University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, that we want to eliminate the humanities, eliminate, English majors or history majors, but we should consider the role of all disciplines in terms of the particular economies that we're serving locally. We want to provide some choice, but we want to inform. And then we also want to focus on our unique institutional competencies. What is it that we do well? And we want to get better at integrating our offerings with the offerings of other providers in the marketplace. That is simply the reality of the day. And so if we just think about all of these new apps and platforms that are competing with career services, there are a variety of ways you might keep tabs on these organizations. On one hand, they might very well be service providers that you want to contract with because they provide value and they're fairly inexpensive. On the other hand, they might just represent competitors you want to keep a close eye on, so that if you're delivering similar sorts of value yourself, you're able to talk about it in the same way that students might hear if they were looking at other institutions. Or you may see things that they are doing that you could develop internally yourselves. So lots of reasons to keep an eye on some of these creative new organizations in the marketplace. And then you want to consider, well, where should we do it ourselves? Where should we partner? And then you also want to think of the university as a talent development partner, not something at a remove, not that sort of tower on the hill, but rather an organization that is an integral contributor to the economic development in the region and someone who partners closely with the other actors in that ecosystem. And of course, we want to enrich lives, we want to nurture curiosity, and we want to be there throughout the lifetimes for our alumni so that we can help them continue to develop their skills over the lifetime. So finally, in closing, I would just say, it's important to integrate the capabilities that you already have. Because of our decentralization, because of our siloed structures, we often find that students don't draw on the services that are available to them. Career services tend to get used by 10 or 20% of the student body. Now, because many of our career services offices have 5 or 4 or 6 people in them, you can't have 100% of the students coming to you. We're not set up to deliver service to that many students. But technology of various sorts is making it possible to connect with and service more students. So we should be thinking about those services we do have, about integrating them more effectively. Again, that orientation, first-year experience, student advising, career services, alumni relations. But also, what are the gaps? What don't we do well? And where should we think about either developing that capability internally, or where should we think about partnering with others? And then ultimately, think about how greater collaboration across the ecosystem will create greater benefit and outcomes for everyone who's participating in that ecosystem. So with that, I'll pause and see if there are any questions. I haven't been out of the classroom that long. I can wait.
We're asking that you please stand up to ask your questions so that we can capture you on film forever and ever.
What were some of the skills or techniques that worked well when you consolidated the outreach with employers? And I ask this because at Houston Community College, we service a large service area in the Houston area, and we cross multiple municipalities as well. And so that's always been a challenge for us. And so we're working on that now. We're transforming our career services department so that there is one point of contact for all locations. So what are some of the best practices that you have seen or have implemented in your area that work well?
So let me tell you about some of the worst practices I've seen. When I was charged with this task around account management at Northeastern, the first thing I tried to get my arms around is how many databases do we have on campus that contain employer data? Just counting actual software systems, we had 15 disconnected systems, and that included 3 different isolated instances of Salesforce. Now, that doesn't include all the Access databases and spreadsheets and Post-it notes taped over people's desks. So there was a really heterogeneous system with no chance of having visibility across all of those areas of activity. And our goal in thinking about account management was, first and foremost, to create that kind of visibility. And so that meant thinking about a CRM system. And at that time, Northeastern was placing a bet on Salesforce. There are a variety of different providers out there that can do this. But giving visibility into all of these interactions with employers in the market so that it's not that there needs to be one point of contact for Shell Oil or for GE or for Disney. But you do want the various points of contact to know what one another are doing when they're interacting with those employers. So I would say the first thing is create that visibility and that university-wide data set. And then the second thing would be to use it and to capture those interactions and to record them in the data set so that folks are able to effectively benefit from that information. The other thing that became important for us was to think about both those frontline relationships that were already established, many of which were faculty-led. You can't take those relationships away from faculty, and you don't want to take those relationships away from faculty, but you do want to empower the administrative layer to have visibility into them. And so this is where account management became critical. And what that suggests is not all 3,000 relationships are equal. There are 50 to 100 that are really important. And we need to deliver a different level of service to those organizations because they are recruiting hundreds of students each year. And so we have this equity principle in higher education where we don't like to provide advantage to individual students relative to the whole. We don't like to provide advantage to individual companies relative to the whole. But increasingly, institutions are figuring out how to do this in ways that don't compromise the experience of all students or the experience of all employers. And it has to do with thinking about a kind of a pyramid of value over time. So again, in a Northeastern context where there's a very wide base of thousands of relationships, you want to think about graduating some of those relationships, not all of them, into things like mentoring, into things like corporate philanthropy, into things like research collaboration. But that takes time, years and years and years. And so to move up that pyramid, you need to be able to establish that you've delivered value, that you've engaged, that you've produced good outcomes, and your employer partners need to show that to you as well. So it's about having a philosophy about how to manage those relationships, having access to the data, and then using the data to effectively engage with your employer partners. Question over here.
My question is, how do we get students to engage more? Nowadays, with different vegan styles and food allergies, food doesn't work anymore. How do we get them to come to us?
Right.
Any ideas?
Yeah. Well, a few thoughts on that. And so Ellen had again mentioned this survey that students are given when they arrive, and that just by virtue of asking the question, it gets students to engage in a way they might not have naturally. That's one thing. Returning to the theme of technology, there are also a growing number of companies and apps that are out there that are designed to promote engagement among students. And so I don't know if anyone here in the room is working with Campus Tap or UConnect. There are a variety of these different sorts of platforms out there. But these are phone-based apps that allow you to promote all of those career fairs and affinity groups that you're already managing, but promoting them to students to their phones, which is where they live. My daughter is a cyborg. This is what she looks like all the time. She has this in her hand. I found her asleep in her bed with her phone in front of her the other evening. And so engaging with them where they engage. And so putting that information in front of them. And again, the technology makes it possible to scale those services in ways that hand-to-hand combat can't, especially when we have few human resources to deliver those kinds of services. But I think it's also about proving the benefit, right? And it's not just about getting them to that one event. It's getting them to take some ownership of their own career outcomes. So one of the things that these apps in particular are starting to drive is the notion of engagement around peer communities. It's not about career services so much, it's about learning with your peers about careers. And so these apps make it possible not only for you to find out about the career fair or some other event that's going on, there's a speaker coming in talking about an issue that you're interested in, it also enables you to network with other students who are interested in that issue. And then also it can enable you to get matched up with mentors. Now, the simplistic notion of mentoring is that it's a one-to-one relationship, that it's deep, that it's someone who knows you in some powerful fundamental ways and can provide you with expert guidance. Increasingly, the notion of mentoring is around advisory boards. Build your own personal advisory board. One of the most interesting experiments, in my view, going on in career services right now is at Wellesley College. Wellesley was fortunate enough, I'm sure many of you had this experience, they received a $50 million gift for their career services office. And the head of career services, a woman named Christine Cruz Vergara, reports to the president. Does anyone here in career services report to the president? I mean, that's a pretty powerful signal about how much this matters. And because Wellesley is a women's college, it's trying to create career services for life. It's trying to create a cohort of women that will be successful on a global scale and to bring them into a lifelong dialogue around careers. And so part of that is about community, about peer engagement, about cross-generational engagement, and part of that is powered by technology. Part of that is powered by the experience of going to campus and living there for 4 years. So there are a variety of different ways to think about engagement, but it needs to start day one, not in your 8th semester. And there needs to be that through line. And you need to use tools to do it because it can't just be hand-to-hand. There simply isn't enough bandwidth for us to do that. I think we're just about out of time.
We could probably take one more. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much,
Appreciate your
Mr.
time.
Dr. Stokes.